You wake up. It's dark. It's cold. You don't know what time it is because you have no clock. You don't know what's outside because you have no light. And the thing scratching at your door could be a rat, a neighbor, or something you don't want to think about. You are not in a nightmare. You are in medieval Europe, and you will not last the day. Welcome to Wrapped in Sleep. I hope tonight finds you warm, comfortable, and hopeful, because what you're about to hear will make you grateful for every soft thing around you, your pillow, your blanket, the simple fact that you are safe and still. Before we begin, where in the world are you right now? What time is it where you are? Leave it in the comments. We read every single one. Now, get comfortable. Close your eyes. Let's go back. Tonight, we are going to spend a day in medieval Europe. Not the medieval Europe of movies and television, not the gleaming armor and romantic castles and heroic knights of popular imagination. The real medieval Europe, the one that smelled, the one that hurt, the one where the gap between waking up in the morning and being dead by nightfall was considerably narrower than anything you have ever experienced. We are going to follow the hours of a single day, from the first gray light of a medieval morning to the long, strange darkness of a medieval night. We are going to look at what people ate and what they wore and what they believed and what they feared. We are going to look at the work and the illness and the faith and the violence and the small, stubborn moments of joy that human beings manage to find even in the most difficult circumstances. And at the end of it, I think you will feel something unexpected, not horror exactly, not pity exactly, something closer to recognition. Because the people we are going to spend today with were not different from you in any way that matters. They loved their children. They worried about money. They complained about the weather. They had favorite foods and least favorite neighbors and things that made them laugh unexpectedly at the wrong moment. They were, in every way that counts, human. They just lived in a world that was trying, in every possible way, to kill them. Before we begin the day, we need to understand the world. The medieval period in Europe spans roughly 1,000 years, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century to the beginning of the Renaissance in the 15th. 1,000 years is an enormous span of time, and life in medieval Europe in 800 CE was considerably different from life in medieval Europe in 1300 CE. The early medieval period, the so-called Dark Ages, a term historians now largely avoid because it misrepresents the complexity and achievement of the era, was characterized by the fragmentation of political authority, the contraction of urban life, and a general reduction in the complexity of economic and cultural organization. By the high medieval period, roughly 1000 to 1300 CE, Europe had restabilized. Towns were growing. Trade was expanding. The great cathedrals were being built. Universities were being founded. The church had consolidated its authority into one of the most sophisticated institutional structures in human history. But for the ordinary person, the peasant farmer, the urban laborer, the craftsman, the servant, the improvements of the high medieval period were largely improvements at the margins. Life was still hard. It was hard in ways that are almost impossible for a person living in the modern world to fully imagine. Let's try anyway. The day begins before dawn, not because anyone has set an alarm. There are no alarms. Not because anyone has decided that this is a good time to wake up. The day begins before dawn because it has to, because the animals need tending, and the fire needs building, and the work will not wait for the sun. In a typical medieval peasant household, a single-room structure probably, with walls of wattle and daub, a thatched roof, a dirt floor, the inhabitants have been sleeping in their clothes, not because they couldn't undress, but because the house is cold. Even in summer, medieval houses were cold at night. In winter, they were genuinely dangerous. The fire in the central hearth. There is no chimney in many peasant dwellings, just a hole in the roof for the smoke to escape, which it does only partially, has burned down to embers overnight. The first task of the morning is to get it going again. This is not as simple as it sounds. Fire starting in the medieval period, before the invention of matches, required skill and patience. The most common method involved a piece of iron called a fire steel, a sharp piece of flint, and a small bundle of dried fungus or plant material called tinder. You strike the steel against the flint, directing the sparks onto the tinder, and coax the tiny smoldering point into a flame. Then you feed that flame carefully, first with dry grass or shredded bark, then with small sticks, and then with larger wood, building it up gradually, not adding too much too fast or you'll smother it. On a cold morning, with cold hands, with wet wood, because the wood is often wet, because storage is imperfect and the thatch leaks, this could take 15 or 20 minutes of dedicated effort before the fire was burning reliably, every morning, every day, 7 days a week, for your entire life. This is the texture of medieval existence, not dramatic suffering, just the relentless, accumulated weight of doing difficult things over and over, with inadequate tools, in difficult conditions, without the option of not doing them. While the fire is being rebuilt, the animals need attention. Most medieval peasant households kept animals, not on a separate farm with separate buildings, at a comfortable distance from the living quarters, in many cases in the same building. The animals lived in the house, or in an attached byre, separated from the human living space by a low wall or a hanging cloth. In winter especially, this arrangement was almost universal. The body heat of the animals helped warm the house. The house helped keep the animals from freezing. This meant that the typical medieval home smelled strongly of animal, of manure, of urine, of wet hide and hay. The smell was so pervasive and so constant that people who lived in it largely stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing the particular smell of your own home. But it was there. A visitor arriving at a medieval peasant dwelling for the first time would have been struck by it immediately. The animals needed feeding. The cow, if there was a cow, a significant luxury beyond the means of many peasant households, needed milking. The chickens needed releasing from whatever enclosure kept them safe from foxes overnight. If there were pigs, they needed checking. All of this before breakfast. Breakfast, when it came, was not what you are imagining. The medieval diet is one of the aspects of medieval life most thoroughly misrepresented in popular culture. The image of the medieval feast, the roasted boar, the flagons of wine, the mountains of food piled on long tables, reflects the diet of the nobility on special occasions. it has essentially nothing to do with the diet of the 90% of the population who were not nobility. For a medieval peasant, the primary food was bread, not the soft, white, uniform bread of a modern bakery, a dense, dark bread made from whatever grain was available, often rye, sometimes barley, occasionally oats. Wheat bread, what we would now call white bread, was a luxury, available to the wealthy, out of reach for most ordinary people. The bread was accompanied, if you were fortunate, by pottage, a thick soup or stew made from whatever vegetables were available. In spring and summer, this might include fresh vegetables from the kitchen garden, onions, leeks, peas, beans, cabbages, turnips. In winter, when fresh vegetables were unavailable, the pottage was made from dried and preserved ingredients, dried peas, dried beans, preserved onions, or from root vegetables that could be stored through the cold months. Meat was rare, not rare in the sense of occasional, rare in the sense of genuinely infrequent for most people. Fresh meat, beef, pork, lamb, was expensive, and most peasant households could not afford to slaughter their animals simply for food. Animals were working assets. They pulled plows, produced milk, laid eggs. You did not kill a working asset unless you had to. What meat was available tended to be preserved rather than fresh, salted, smoked, or dried. Small animals, rabbits, pigeons, songbirds, could be hunted or trapped, and this provided some protein. But the legal right to hunt larger game was strictly controlled by the nobility, and a peasant caught taking a deer from the lord's forest faced severe punishment. Poaching was a desperate act, not a casual supplement to the diet. Fish was more available, particularly in communities near rivers or the coast. The Church's requirement that Christians abstain from meat on Fridays and during Lent, approximately 150 days per year in total, created both a theological and a practical demand for fish. Fish markets existed in most medieval towns. Dried, salted, or smoked fish could be transported and stored. For many medieval Europeans, fish was the primary source of animal protein. Dairy products, milk, butter, and cheese were available to households that kept cows or goats and were an important source of nutrition. Eggs from the household's chickens were similarly valuable. Honey was the primary sweetener since sugar was an expensive import, available only to the wealthy. The overall picture is a diet that was heavy in carbohydrates, bread, pottage, root vegetables, and relatively low in protein and fat. Not necessarily a starvation diet. In good years, with adequate harvests, medieval peasants could eat enough, but a diet that was nutritionally precarious. One bad harvest away from serious deficiency, and bad harvests were not rare. After breakfast, such as it was, the work began. The rhythm of the medieval agricultural year was governed by the seasons in ways that are difficult to appreciate in an era of year-round food supply and climate-controlled environments. Medieval agriculture was subsistence agriculture for most of the population. You grew what you ate, and if you grew enough, you ate. If you didn't, you didn't. The farming system most commonly used in medieval Europe was the three-field system. The land around a village was divided into 3 large fields. In any given year, one field was planted with winter crops, wheat or rye, planted in autumn and harvested the following summer. A second field was planted with spring crops, barley, oats, peas, beans, planted in spring and harvested in late summer. The third field was left fallow, unplanted, allowed to rest and recover its fertility. The following year, the fields rotated. The winter field became the spring field. The spring field became the fallow. The fallow became the winter field. This rotation maintained soil fertility over time, not perfectly, but adequately in most years for the yields required. The work this system demanded was relentless and physical in a way that is almost incomprehensible to someone who has never done sustained agricultural labor. Plowing required guiding an ox or horse-drawn plow through heavy, wet soil for hours at a time. Sowing required walking the length of the field repeatedly, broadcasting seed by hand. Weeding required bending over the rows day after day in the summer heat. Harvesting, the most critical and most time-pressured phase, when the grain had to be cut before rain could ruin it, required every available person in the community working from dawn to dusk for days or weeks at a stretch. The tools available for all of this work were simple and heavy. The plow was typically made of wood with an iron-tipped plowshare, effective in lighter soils, but laborious in the heavy clay soils common in much of northern Europe. The scythe and the sickle, curved blades for cutting grain, were the primary harvesting tools. Threshing, separating the grain from the straw, was done by beating the harvested plants with a wooden flail on a hard floor, hour after hour, day after day. All of this work was done by hand, by body, by the accumulated strength of people who had been doing physical labor their entire lives and whose bodies reflected that fact. Calloused hands, developed muscles, chronic back pain from years of bending and lifting, joint problems that accumulated over decades of heavy use. The average medieval peasant walked between 10 and 15 miles per day in the course of ordinary work. They lifted and carried and pulled and dug. They were, in the purely physical sense, significantly stronger than the average modern person. They were also significantly more worn. By their 30s, many had bodies that showed the accumulated damage of a life of hard physical labor. Let's talk about the body, because in medieval Europe, your body was the primary instrument of your survival, and the relationship between medieval people and their own physical existence was fundamentally different from anything a modern person experiences. Pain was constant and largely untreated, not the dramatic pain of acute injury, necessarily, though that too, but the chronic, low-level pain that accumulated from hard physical labor, from sleeping on hard surfaces, or from cold and damp, from dental problems, from the ordinary wear of difficult conditions. Dental pain deserves special mention. In the absence of modern dentistry, no drilling, no filling, no root canals, no fluoride toothpaste, tooth decay was endemic in medieval populations. It began early, progressed slowly, and eventually became severe enough to affect quality of life significantly. An abscessed tooth, which is merely an expensive and uncomfortable visit to the dentist in the modern world, was a potentially life-threatening condition in the medieval period. The infection could spread to the jaw, to the skull, to the brain. The treatment for a severely painful tooth was extraction, without anesthetic, by whoever in the community had the strongest hands and the most experience pulling teeth, which might be a barber surgeon in a town, or simply the strongest person available in a rural village. You sat in a chair, or were held down, and the tooth was pulled out with iron pliers, without anything to dull the pain. Childbirth was perhaps the greatest single physical risk in medieval life, at least for women. The maternal mortality rate in medieval Europe is estimated at somewhere between 1 and 3% per birth, meaning that between 1 and 3 women out of every 100 died in or shortly after childbirth. This sounds relatively low in percentage terms, but when you consider that the average medieval woman who survived childhood might give birth 5, 6, 7, or more times over her reproductive years, the cumulative risk was substantial. A woman who gave birth 6 times had a roughly 10 to 15% chance of dying in one of those births. The causes were those that are still the primary causes of maternal death in the modern developing world: hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor. Without surgical options, without blood transfusions, without antibiotics, without the ability to perform a cesarean section with any reasonable chance of survival for the mother, in the event of a seriously obstructed labor, the choice was often between the mother's life and the child's, and the church generally required that the child be baptized even if the mother died in the attempt. And midwives, women with experience in childbirth who attended births in their community, were the primary practitioners of obstetric care. Their knowledge was practical and largely effective for straightforward births, but in complicated cases, their options were severely limited. The result was that every woman who became pregnant in medieval Europe knew at some level that the pregnancy might kill her. This was not abstract knowledge. It was immediate, personal, grounded in the experience of watching neighbors and relatives die. It shaped the emotional texture of pregnancy and childbirth in ways that are difficult to imagine from the perspective of a modern world where maternal mortality in developed countries has been reduced to a small fraction of 1%. Medicine in medieval Europe was a complex and contradictory field, combining genuine empirical knowledge with theoretical frameworks that were often worse than useless. The dominant medical framework, inherited from ancient Greek medicine and elaborated by Islamic scholars whose works had been translated into Latin, was the theory of the 4 humors. A healthy body was one in which blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile existed in proper balance. Disease was an imbalance. Treatment was restoration of balance through bleeding, purging, dietary adjustment, and herbal remedies. The bleeding, venesection, the deliberate opening of a vein to remove blood, was among the most commonly practiced medical procedures in medieval Europe. The logic was that excess blood, or blood that had become corrupted, was causing the patient's symptoms, and removing some of it would restore the humoral balance. In practice, this frequently weakened already ill patients. In some cases, it killed them. In essentially no cases did it address the actual cause of the illness. The herbal remedies were more genuinely useful. Medieval pharmacopoeias contained hundreds of plant-based preparations accumulated over centuries of empirical observation. Some of these, willow bark, which contains salicin, the active ingredient in aspirin, poppy preparations, which contain opiates, valerian, which has genuine sedative properties, had real pharmacological effects. Others were ineffective or harmful. The distinction was not well understood. Surgery was practiced with a courage and skill that deserve acknowledgement given the conditions. Medieval surgeons performed amputations, removed cataracts, drained abscesses, treated wounds, and in some cases attempted far more complex procedures. They worked without general anesthesia. Opium preparations and alcohol could reduce pain somewhat, but not eliminate it, and without any understanding of infection. This last point is crucial. The germ theory of disease, the understanding that many illnesses are caused by microscopic organisms and that preventing their transmission prevents the illness, would not be developed until the 19th century. Medieval surgeons operated with unsterilized instruments in unclean environments without washing their hands. The most technically successful surgery could be followed by a fatal infection, and there was no way to predict or prevent this outcome. The mortality rate from medieval surgery was consequently very high, not because medieval surgeons were incompetent, many were skilled and careful practitioners, but because they were missing the single most important piece of knowledge in the history of medicine. Infection killed more medieval surgical patients than the original condition. Alongside formally trained physicians and surgeons who were expensive, concentrated in towns, and unavailable to most of the rural population, existed a vast informal medical tradition. Wise women, herbalists, cunning folk, practitioners who combined genuine herbal knowledge with ritual elements, prayer, and folk magic. Their services were cheaper and more accessible than those of formal medicine. Their outcomes were not notably worse. In a world where the formal medical system was as likely to harm as to help, this is less surprising than it might seem. The Church's attitude toward folk medicine was ambiguous. Prayers and religious remedies, the invocation of saints, pilgrimages to healing shrines, the application of holy water, were not only acceptable but actively encouraged. The boundary between acceptable religious healing and unacceptable magic was unclear and shifted over time and by region. What is clear is that medieval people were not passive in the face of illness. They tried everything available to them. They prayed. They consulted physicians if they could afford one. They used herbal remedies. They visited healing shrines. They called on the wise woman in the next village. They did all of these things simultaneously without seeing any contradiction between them. They were desperate and creative and human and trying. Let's talk about the things that killed people, because death in medieval Europe was both more present and more varied in its causes than death in the modern developed world, and understanding it is essential to understanding how medieval people lived. The leading causes of death in medieval Europe were infectious disease, malnutrition, childbirth complications, and violence, in that order roughly, though the proportions varied enormously by time, place, and social class. Infectious disease covered an enormous range of conditions. Bubonic plague, which we have already discussed, was the most dramatic and the most lethal, but it was not the only epidemic disease that swept through medieval populations. Smallpox was endemic, killing children at high rates and leaving survivors permanently scarred. Typhus, spread by lice, was a constant presence in the crowded, poorly washed conditions of medieval life. Dysentery, intestinal infection causing severe diarrhea, was endemic and often fatal, particularly in children. Malaria was present in much of Europe until the drainage of wetlands in the early modern period. Ergotism, caused by eating grain contaminated with the ergot fungus, produced mass outbreaks of convulsions, hallucinations, and gangrene in affected communities. The common cold and influenza, which are merely inconvenient to a well-nourished modern person with access to rest and over-the-counter medication, could be fatal to a medieval person already weakened by malnutrition, physical exhaustion, and a lifetime of marginal health. Malnutrition interacted with infectious disease in ways that multiplied the lethality of both. A malnourished immune system is a compromised immune system. A person who is already weakened by inadequate protein intake or vitamin deficiency is far more likely to die from an infectious disease that a well-nourished person might survive. The famine years, and there were many famine years in medieval Europe. A significant harvest failure occurred somewhere in Europe on average once every 5 to 7 years, killed directly through starvation and indirectly through the infectious diseases that swept through populations weakened by hunger. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed an estimated 10 to 25% of the population of Northern Europe. People ate things that were not food. They ate bark and leaves, and in the most desperate circumstances, things worse than that. The chronicles of the period record acts of desperation that would be unthinkable in normal times, and then record, with equal matter-of-factness, the return of something like normality when the rains finally came and the harvest recovered. Medieval people were extraordinarily resilient. They had to be. The alternative was not surviving. Violence was the third major cause of death, and it operated at every level of medieval society. At the top, the violence of war. Medieval warfare was not the organized, rules-governed conflict of modern warfare, though it had its own rules and customs, which were frequently violated. It was brutal, close range, and lethal. The technology of medieval warfare, swords, axes, spears, bows, and later crossbows and early firearms, was designed to kill efficiently, and it did. But the violence that affected ordinary people most directly was not large-scale warfare. It was the low-level, endemic violence of a society without effective policing. The violence of bandits on the roads, of raiding parties crossing borders, of local lords asserting their authority through force, of disputes between neighbors escalating to blows, of the casual brutality that can characterize communities where physical strength is the primary guarantor of safety. Medieval law was harsh by modern standards, and its enforcement was inconsistent. Capital punishment was applied for offenses that modern legal systems would treat as minor. Mutilation, the removal of hands, ears, or other body parts, was a standard penalty for theft and other property crimes. Public execution was a community event, attended by large crowds, understood as both punishment and deterrent. The experience of violence, as perpetrator, as victim, as witness, was simply more common in medieval life than in modern developed world life. Not universal, not constant, but present in a way that shaped how people understood safety, authority, and the relationship between strength and survival. And yet, and this is important, medieval violence has been significantly overstated in popular imagination. The image of the medieval period as an unrelenting nightmare of brutality misrepresents the actual texture of most people's daily lives. the vast majority of medieval people, most of the time, were not experiencing direct violence. They were working, they were eating, they were raising children, they were arguing with their neighbors about property boundaries and gossiping about the priest's behavior, and falling in love and falling out of love, and doing all the ordinary, undramatic things that constitute most of any life in any era. The violence was real, the suffering was real, but it was not the entirety of experience. It was the backdrop against which ordinary life was lived, present enough to shape behavior and belief, but not so omnipresent as to crowd out everything else. Let's talk about women, because any account of medieval life that focuses primarily on the experience of men is an incomplete account, and the experience of medieval women was both similar to and significantly different from the experience of medieval men. At every level of medieval society, a woman occupied a formally subordinate position. In law, a married woman's legal identity was largely subsumed in her husband's. She could not own property independently, could not make contracts, could not appear in court in her own right in most circumstances. In theology, women were understood as spiritually and morally weaker than men, the daughters of Eve, prone to temptation, in need of guidance and control. In practice, the gap between formal subordination and actual experience was considerably more complex. Medieval women worked. They worked hard, in ways that were as physically demanding as men's work, and in addition to men's work. The domestic labor of a medieval household, the cooking, the cleaning, the child-rearing, the textile production, the care of the sick, was primarily women's work. This was in addition to, not instead of, participation in agricultural labor at critical times of the year. Textile production deserves special mention. The spinning of fiber into thread and the weaving of thread into cloth was one of the most time-consuming tasks in a medieval household, and it was overwhelmingly women's work. The iconic image of a medieval woman with a distaff, the spindle used for spinning, is not a romantic symbol. It is a representation of an economic reality. Cloth was expensive. Every household needed cloth for clothing and other uses. Producing it in-house was the primary means by which peasant households met this need. Women spun in every available moment, while watching children, while talking, while waiting for other tasks to complete. The phrase spinster, meaning an unmarried woman, reflects the historical reality that spinning was so ubiquitously women's work that it became an identifier for women who were defined primarily by that work rather than by their relationship to a husband. Medieval women also participated in trade and commerce, particularly in urban settings. Guilds, the professional associations that regulated most skilled trades in medieval towns, generally excluded women, but women participated in the informal economy at every level. They sold goods in markets. They ran inns and taverns. They worked as midwives and healers. They contributed to the economic life of their communities in ways that the formal record often obscures. The religious life offered medieval women an alternative to the standard path of marriage and motherhood, the convent. Women who entered religious life as nuns could, in principle, pursue education, intellectual work, and spiritual development to a degree unavailable to lay women. The great female religious figures of the medieval period, Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, Catherine of Siena, achieved intellectual and spiritual authority that would have been impossible outside the religious context. But the convent was not available to most women. Entry required a dowry, a payment to the institution that was beyond the means of most families. The population of medieval convents was heavily skewed toward the nobility and the upper classes. For the vast majority of medieval women, the peasant women, the artisan wives, the servants, the religious life remained a theoretical alternative rather than a practical one. They lived their faith through the ordinary rhythms of church attendance, prayer, and the religious festivals that structured the calendar, not through formal religious vocation. Children in medieval Europe occupied a position that has been much debated by historians. The earlier historical consensus, articulated most influentially by Philippe Ariès in his 1960 work, Centuries of Childhood, held that medieval people did not have the modern concept of childhood as a distinct phase of life. Children, in this view, were treated as small adults from the earliest age, put to work as soon as they were physically capable, and not afforded the emotional investment and protective concern that modern children receive. This view has been substantially revised by subsequent scholarship. The evidence from literature, from art, from legal records, from material culture suggests that medieval parents loved their children, mourned their deaths, invested in their education and futures, and understood childhood as distinct from adulthood. But the practical circumstances of childhood in medieval Europe were genuinely hard. Child mortality was catastrophic by modern standards. In some populations and periods, as many as 1 in 3 children died before their 5th birthday. In communities affected by epidemic disease or famine, the proportion was higher. The loss of children was an expected part of medieval life in a way that is genuinely difficult to comprehend from the perspective of a world in which child mortality in developed countries has been reduced to a tiny fraction of historical rates. Children who survived infancy were put to work young, not out of callousness, but out of necessity. A peasant household needed every available pair of hands. Children old enough to walk could scare birds from crops. Children old enough to be trusted could mind younger siblings while parents worked. Children in artisan families were apprenticed to their parents' trade from an early age, not to deprive them of childhood, but because the trade would be their livelihood, and learning it took years. Formal education was available only to a minority. The church operated schools in connection with monasteries and cathedrals, but access was primarily for boys, primarily for those destined for religious life, and primarily in towns. Rural children, the children of peasants, were largely without access to formal schooling. Literacy rates in medieval Europe varied enormously by time, place, and social class. By the high medieval period, literacy was common among the clergy and increasingly common among the urban merchant class. Among the rural peasantry, it was rare. The majority of medieval Europeans lived in a world of oral culture, information transmitted through speech, through memory, through the visual language of church art and stained glass, rather than through written text. Now let's come to the thing that shaped everything else, the thing that was present in every moment of every day, that structured time and meaning, and morality and identity, the church. For a medieval European, and we are speaking here of the vast majority of the population who were Christians of the Latin Rite. The Catholic Church was not one institution among many. It was the framework through which reality was understood. It explained where the world came from and what it was for and what happened after you died. It provided the rituals that marked every transition of life, from birth to marriage to death. It owned, in aggregate, somewhere between a quarter and a third of all the agricultural land in Western Europe. It ran the hospitals and the schools and the only institutions that provided social welfare. It was simultaneously a spiritual authority, an economic power, a political force, and a cultural institution. To be a medieval European was, almost without exception, to be embedded in the Church. Not in the way that many modern people are nominally religious, attending services occasionally, in believing vaguely in something higher, but largely organizing their lives around secular concerns. Embedded, thoroughly, inescapably, pervasively embedded. The medieval calendar was a church calendar. The year was organized not around secular events, not around agricultural seasons, though these were recognized, but around the liturgical cycle. Advent and Christmas, Lent and Easter, the feast days of the saints, which were holy days, hence holidays, on which work was suspended and the community gathered to celebrate. A medieval European in a typical year would have between 50 and 80 such days, roughly 1 to 1.5 per week, on which ordinary labor stopped. This had profound practical consequences. It meant that the medieval agricultural year was shorter than the calendar year in terms of available working days. It meant that communities gathered repeatedly throughout the year for collective celebration, and it meant that the rhythm of work and rest was punctuated by events of religious significance, not arbitrary breaks, but meaningful pauses in which the community affirmed its relationship to the sacred. The saints were not abstractions, they were real presences, intermediaries between the human and the divine, accessible through prayer, capable of intervention in earthly affairs. Different saints had different specializations. Saint Anthony for lost items, Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Christopher for travelers, Saint Bridget for midwives and newborns. When you had a toothache, you prayed to Saint Apollonia, not because you necessarily expected a miracle, but because she was the appropriate person to ask. The parish church was the center of community life in a way that is difficult to recapture from a modern perspective. Not just religious community life, all community life. It was where people gathered, not only for services, but for meetings, for celebrations, for the adjudication of disputes. The churchyard, the land surrounding the church, where the dead were buried, was a social space as well as a sacred one. Children played there, adults met there, business was conducted there. The priest, the local representative of the church, the person who administered the sacraments, who preached, who heard confession, who buried the dead, was simultaneously a religious figure and a community leader. His quality varied enormously. Some medieval priests were educated, devout, and genuinely committed to their pastoral role. Others were poorly educated, sometimes barely literate, holding their position by virtue of a patron's favor rather than any particular qualification. The medieval church was not a monolith. It was a vast, complex, often internally contradictory institution, containing within it genuine holiness and profound corruption, intellectual brilliance and deep ignorance, charitable care for the poor and ruthless exploitation of the same poor. The gap between the ideals articulated by its best thinkers and the realities practiced by its institutions was enormous and widely known. Medieval people were not naive about this gap. The complaints against clerical corruption, against the greed of monks and the immorality of priests, against the sale of indulgences and the abuse of church power, these were not 16th century Protestant innovations. They were a constant presence in medieval culture, expressed in literature, in sermons, in popular satire. And yet the faith persisted, because the faith was not primarily faith in the institution. It was faith in the reality of God, in the power of the saints, in the promise of salvation. The institution could be corrupt, and the faith could still be real. Let's come to nightfall. The medieval day ended with the darkness, and the darkness of a medieval night was a different thing from anything experienced in the modern world. There are no electric lights in medieval Europe. There are no gas lamps. There are no street lights. After dark, the light available to ordinary people was the light of fire, hearth fire, tallow candles, oil lamps. These were expensive, not prohibitively expensive, but costly enough that they were used carefully. A tallow candle produced a small, warm, slightly smoky light that illuminated a radius of perhaps a meter. It was enough to see by at close range. It was not enough to turn night into something resembling day. The result was that medieval nights were genuinely dark. Outside, on a cloudy night with no moon, a medieval town or village was lit only by whatever firelight leaked from windows and doors. The roads were invisible. The faces of strangers were unreadable. The same landscape that was navigable by day became disorienting and potentially dangerous by night. Medieval people were afraid of the dark, not in the childlike sense of being afraid of what might be in the closet, in the serious, practical sense of understanding that darkness created real risks. Crime was harder to prevent and harder to prosecute when committed in darkness. Accidents, falls, fires, getting lost were more likely, and the boundary between the natural and the supernatural felt thinner at night in ways that the medieval cosmology took seriously. The night was understood in medieval religious thought as the domain of spiritual danger. The hours between dusk and dawn were when demons were most active, when temptation was strongest, when prayer was most necessary. The night offices of the monastic tradition, the prayers said at midnight and before dawn, were not merely traditional. They were understood as a genuine spiritual necessity, a form of watchfulness against the dangers of the dark. In secular life, the curfew, from the old French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, was a practical institution as well as a metaphor. At a set time each evening, church bells rang to signal that fires should be covered or extinguished for the night, and that people should be inside their homes. Moving through town after curfew without a lantern and a legitimate purpose was legally suspect in many medieval communities. Sleep itself in medieval Europe was different from modern sleep in ways that are only recently being appreciated by historians and sleep researchers. The historian A. Roger E. Kirch, in his landmark study, At Day's Close Night in Times Past, documented a remarkable historical pattern. For most of human history, Until the Industrial Revolution and the advent of artificial lighting, people in temperate climates did not sleep in a single continuous block of 7 or 8 hours. Instead, they slept in 2 separate periods, divided by an hour or 2 of wakefulness in the middle of the night. The first sleep began shortly after dark and lasted until roughly midnight or 1 in the morning. The person then woke, not because of a disturbance, but naturally, as part of their normal sleep cycle, and spent an hour or 2 awake in what medieval sources call the watch, or the first waking. During this time, people would pray, reflect, have quiet conversations with spouses or household members, engage in light domestic activities, or simply lie in the dark in a state of relaxed semi-wakefulness. Then, around 2 or 3 in the morning, the second sleep began, lasting until dawn. This pattern, segmented sleep, with a waking period in the middle of the night, is documented across a remarkable range of medieval and early modern sources. It appears in medical texts, in court records, in literary works, in religious writings. It was apparently so normal and so expected that it required no explanation or comment in most of the sources that mention it. The implications are significant. The first waking was not insomnia. It was not a sleep disorder. It was the normal middle period of a normal night. Medieval people did not lie awake in the middle of the night worrying that they couldn't sleep. They lay awake because they were supposed to, because their bodies expected this period of wakefulness, because it was simply how the night worked. The disappearance of segmented sleep in the modern world, the shift to consolidated, single-period sleep, appears to be a consequence of artificial lighting. When light became available through the night, people extended their evening activities, pushed the start of their sleep later, and gradually consolidated their sleep into a single block to accommodate the earlier start of the working day. The result, some sleep researchers now suggest, is that many modern people are chronically sleep deprived, not because they sleep fewer total hours than their medieval ancestors, but because they have lost the natural middle-of-the-night waking period that allowed the sleep cycle to complete itself naturally. Medieval people may, in this one respect at least, have slept better than we do. The house was cold again by now. The fire had been banked, covered with ash to keep it alive through the night without consuming all the fuel, but the heat it had provided during the evening had dissipated. The family lay together for warmth, adults and children in the same bed or on the same sleeping surface, sharing body heat in the way that was standard practice before the modern era of separate beds in separate rooms. Privacy, as modernity understands it, barely existed in medieval domestic life. The single-room peasant house meant that everything, eating, sleeping, working, arguing, making love, happened in the same space, in the presence of the same people, without the separation that modern people take for granted. This was not experienced as deprivation, particularly. It was simply the normal texture of life. The desire for private space, for a room of one's own, to use Virginia Woolf's later formulation, is in many ways a modern desire, shaped by the material conditions that made private space possible. The second sleep came eventually, and with it, dreams. Medieval people took dreams seriously. Not all dreams. The Church distinguished between meaningless dreams, produced by the body's processes, and meaningful dreams, through which God or his angels could communicate. The literature of the period is full of significant dreams, prophetic, symbolic, morally instructive. Dream interpretation was a recognized intellectual activity. Whether medieval dreams were different in content from modern dreams is impossible to know directly, but the framework through which they were interpreted was different. A modern person waking from a disturbing dream might analyze it in terms of unresolved anxiety or suppressed desire. A medieval person waking from the same dream might examine it for spiritual meaning. Was it a warning from God, a temptation from the devil, a message from the soul of a deceased relative? The night had meaning, the darkness had meaning, even sleep and dreams had meaning. In a world without the secular frameworks through which modern people organize their experience, meaning was everywhere. Everything pointed to something beyond itself. The ordinary and the sacred were not separate categories, but the same reality seen from different angles. Let's talk about the village, because the village was not merely where medieval people lived, it was what they were. The typical medieval village in Western Europe was a small place, perhaps 30 to 60 households, 200 to 400 people, clustered together on the land their families had farmed for generations. It had a church. It had a mill. The mill was essential because grain had to be ground into flour, and the Lord typically owned the mill and charged for its use. It had a common, shared land where villagers could graze their animals. It had a blacksmith, usually, and perhaps a carpenter and an alewife who brewed the ale that was the primary safe beverage of daily life. And it had boundaries, not walls necessarily, though some villages had palisades for defense, but understood, lived boundaries, the edge of the village fields, beyond which lay the Lord's hunting forest, the waste, the uncultivated land that was both resource and threat. The boundary between this village and the next, maintained through generations of negotiation, dispute, and occasional violence. The boundary between the familiar and the unknown that shaped how medieval people understood safety and danger. Most medieval peasants were born, lived, and died within a few miles of their birthplace, not because they were legally prevented from traveling, though serfs often were, but because the village was their world. It contained everything they needed, or everything that was available to them: the family, the community, the church, the fields, the market. The world beyond the village was vaguely known, dimly imagined, largely irrelevant to daily life. This geographical rootedness shaped identity in profound ways. You were not primarily an individual with a name. You were Thomas from Ashton, or Margaret the miller's daughter, or William who lived by the mill. Your identity was relational, placed, embedded in a specific landscape and a specific community. You were known by your neighbors with a thoroughness and a continuity that is rare in modern mobile societies. They had known you since you were born. They would know your children. They would bury you. This could be suffocating. The lack of privacy, the impossibility of reinvention, the weight of everyone knowing everything about you. These were real constraints on individual freedom. But the knowing was also a form of security. You were embedded. You were accountable. And you were, in the deepest sense, not alone. The relationships within a medieval village were dense, layered, and complicated. Neighbors were also co-workers. In the three-field system, The strips of land belonging to different families were interleaved, and agricultural decisions had to be made collectively. They were also creditors and debtors. The informal economy of favors, loans, and mutual assistance that sustained village life operated through constant negotiation and occasional dispute. They were also witnesses to your contracts, your quarrels, your behavior in church, your conduct with your spouse. Village courts, the manorial courts that handled the everyday disputes of rural life, were busy institutions. The records that survive from medieval manorial courts are a remarkable window into the texture of village social life. Disputes over boundary stones and grazing rights, accusations of petty theft and defamation, complaints about a neighbor's pig breaking through a fence. The conflicts are small and relentless and entirely human. People have always argued about the same things. The resolution of these disputes was largely communal. The court consisted of the villagers themselves, sitting in judgment on their neighbors, applying the customary law of the manor, the accumulated tradition of how things had always been done, to specific situations. This was not an abstract legal process. It was community self-governance, messy and inconsistent, and thoroughly embedded in local relationships and local knowledge. Now let's talk about travel, because while most medieval people rarely traveled far from their birthplace, travel did happen, and when it did, it was an undertaking of genuine difficulty and genuine danger. The roads of medieval Europe were not, in most cases, paved. The Roman road network, the most sophisticated road system the ancient world had produced, built of stone, cambered for drainage, maintained by the imperial administration, had been allowed to deteriorate after the fall of the Western Empire, and most of it had been reduced by the medieval period to a memory beneath the grass. What remained were tracks, dirt paths that became impassable mud in wet weather, that were maintained or not maintained by local custom and local effort, that narrowed and widened unpredictably depending on who had most recently tried to avoid the worst section. Traveling these roads in good weather was unpleasant. Traveling them in bad weather was miserable. Traveling them in winter was sometimes impossible. The primary means of travel were on foot and on horseback. For ordinary people without horses, which was most ordinary people, walking was the default. A fit adult could walk perhaps 20 to 30 miles in a day under reasonable conditions. This meant that a journey of 100 miles, the distance from London to the Welsh border, say, would take 4 to 5 days of hard walking. Travel by horse was faster, perhaps 40 to 50 miles per day on good roads, but horses were expensive to own and maintain. The use of horses for long-distance travel was primarily the privilege of the wealthy, knights, merchants, and ecclesiastical officials who could afford both the animal and the fodder it required. Rivers were also used for transport where geography permitted. Water transport was cheaper and in some ways easier than road transport for heavy goods. The medieval economy moved its bulk commodities, its grain and timber and stone, by water wherever possible. But rivers were not always where you needed to go, and their use was complicated by seasonal variation, by the tolls charged at bridges and fords, and by the hazards of navigation. The dangers of travel in medieval Europe were real and various. Bandits were a genuine concern, particularly on roads through forest or waste, terrain where an ambush could be set and escape was easy. The boundary between legitimate poverty and outlaw violence was not always clear. Desperate men, veterans of wars, people driven off their land by crop failure, people whose communities had been destroyed by plague or raid, sometimes turned to highway robbery as a survival strategy. The political fragmentation of medieval Europe, the hundreds of lordships, principalities, and jurisdictions that a traveler might cross in the course of a relatively short journey, created its own hazards. Local authorities had the right to tax, to restrict, to detain. Travelers without the right papers, without the right connections, without a convincing story for why they were on the road, could find themselves in serious trouble. And then there was simply the physical difficulty, the cold, the wet, the exhaustion of walking long distances in bad conditions with inadequate footwear, the challenge of finding food and shelter in unfamiliar places, the disorientation of being somewhere where nobody knew you, and therefore where nobody had any particular reason to help you. Inns existed along the main routes, and they provided some level of shelter and food, but medieval inns were nothing like their modern successors. A traveler at a medieval inn typically shared a room, shared a bed with strangers. Privacy was not available. Security was uncertain. The food was whatever was being cooked that day. The beds were straw mattresses, often infested with the insects that were an unavoidable feature of any medieval sleeping environment. Monasteries provided hospitality to travelers as a matter of religious obligation. The Benedictine rule, the foundational document of Western monasticism, explicitly required the reception of guests as if they were Christ himself. In practice, the quality of monastic hospitality varied with the wealth and disposition of the institution. A wealthy abbey on a major road might maintain a well-equipped guest house with genuine comfort. A poor rural priory might offer only a barn and a bowl of soup. The experience of travel in medieval Europe was, for most people, an experience of discomfort, uncertainty, and dependence on the goodwill of strangers. It was undertaken when necessary, for pilgrimage, for trade, for military service, and avoided when not necessary. The fact that millions of medieval people undertook long pilgrimages to Canterbury, to Compostela, to Rome, to Jerusalem, not because they had to, but because they chose to, because they believed the spiritual benefit was worth the physical cost, tells us something important about medieval faith. It was not passive. It was not merely conventional. It was willing to suffer for its object. Let's talk about money, about the economic lives of medieval people, how wealth was created and distributed, how poverty was experienced, and what the relationship between the two looked like from the inside. The fundamental economic fact of medieval life was that most people had very little money, not in the relative sense in which modern people sometimes describe themselves as having very little money, in the absolute sense of regularly lacking the cash to purchase goods and services they needed. The medieval economy was not primarily a cash economy, particularly in the rural areas where most people lived. It was an economy of obligation, exchange, and kind. Rents were often paid in labor. The serf's obligation to work the Lord's land for a specified number of days per week, per year. Food was produced by the household for the household's consumption. Services were exchanged between neighbors without money changing hands. Cash, actual coins, was needed primarily for purchases that could not be met through local exchange: salt, iron, some textiles, tools, the goods that came from outside the immediate community through trade. For these purposes, medieval peasants needed coin, and coin was chronically scarce. The extraction of resources from the peasantry by the nobility was systematic and comprehensive. Rents, labor obligations, fees for use of the lord's mill and oven and press, tolls on market transactions, fees for legal proceedings in the manorial court. The medieval economy was structured to ensure a steady flow of value from those who produced it to those who owned the land. Taxes added another layer. The medieval state, such as it was, financed itself through direct taxation on the population. In England, the practice of levying direct taxes required the consent of Parliament, and the records of parliamentary taxation provide a remarkable picture of the economic conditions of the period. In France, in Germany, in the Italian city-states, different mechanisms served similar purposes. The burden of these extractions fell most heavily on those least able to bear it: the peasantry, the small artisans, the urban poor. The wealthy, the nobility, and the higher clergy had legal mechanisms to reduce or avoid their tax burdens. The poor had nothing of the kind. Debt was a constant feature of medieval economic life for ordinary people. A bad harvest meant borrowing to make it through the winter, borrowing grain from a neighbor, or money from a moneylender, or both. The interest on medieval loans was high, not because lenders were particularly predatory, but because lending in a world without credit scoring or reliable legal enforcement was genuinely risky. Jewish communities in medieval Europe filled a particular economic niche as moneylenders, partly because canon law prohibited Christians from charging interest, usury was a sin, and partly because Jews were excluded from most other forms of economic participation. The irony that the hostility directed at Jews for their role as moneylenders was a direct consequence of the policies that forced them into that role was not widely appreciated at the time. A debt peonage, the condition of owing more than you could repay and working off the debt indefinitely, was a genuine possibility for medieval people who experienced a serious run of bad luck. The boundary between debt and serfdom was not always clear. The poverty of the medieval world was not abstract. It was the poverty of not having enough food, of children dying from malnutrition-related illness, of wearing the same clothes until they fell apart, of the cold getting in through a roof that needed rethatching, but the materials couldn't be afforded, of watching what you had built and maintained with years of labor swept away by a flood or a fire or a raiding party with no insurance, no state assistance, no safety net of any kind. The church provided charitable relief, hospitals, almshouses, food distribution to the poor, and this was genuinely important in the lives of those who received it. But it was not sufficient to address the systemic poverty that the structure of medieval society produced. The charitable works of the church were a response to a problem that the economic and political structure of medieval society was continuously creating. The poor were always present in medieval society. They were visible on the streets and at the church doors, in a way that the modern tendency to concentrate poverty in specific zones has made less immediately visible in many modern cities. Medieval people saw poverty daily. The moral and religious obligation to respond to it, to give alms, to practice the corporal works of mercy, was constant and inescapable. Whether they always responded is another question. Human nature does not change across centuries. Now let's step into the medieval town. Because not everyone in medieval Europe was a peasant. A growing minority, perhaps 10 to 20% of the population by the high medieval period, lived in towns and cities, and the experience of urban medieval life was different from rural life in important ways, while sharing the fundamental conditions of poverty, vulnerability, and dense community. Medieval towns were small by modern standards. A town of 5,000 people was a significant urban center. Most medieval towns had populations of a few thousand, concentrated within walls that defined the legal and physical boundary of urban space. Within those walls, the density was extraordinary. Streets narrow enough that buildings on opposite sides of an alley nearly touched overhead, blocking sunlight from reaching the street for most of the day. The consequences for health were severe. Sanitation was rudimentary. Human waste was thrown from upper floor windows into the street. Water drawn from wells near cesspits was routinely contaminated. Waterborne disease, dysentery, typhoid was endemic. Fire was a constant danger in towns where buildings were predominantly wood, packed closely together. The guild system organized this urban world. Guilds controlled who could practice a trade, set quality standards, managed apprenticeship. A boy apprenticed at 10 or 12 would spend 7 years in a master's household, learning his craft in exchange for labor. He would then become a journeyman, free but economically precarious. The few who achieved the status of master, producing a masterpiece to demonstrate their skill, paying substantial guild fees, joined a community that provided social security, mutual support, and genuine belonging. The urban poor who fell outside this system had none of these protections. They begged at church doors and monastery gates, survived on casual labor and charity. He died younger and harder than almost everyone else in an already hard world. Now let's talk about joy, because we have spent a great deal of time on the difficulty, and the difficulty was real, but it was not the whole story. Medieval people knew how to celebrate. The liturgical calendar provided a framework of celebration that punctuated the year with genuine festivity. Christmas was a 12-day celebration, not the single day of modern observance, but a season of feasting, visiting, music, and games that lasted from Christmas Day to Epiphany on January 6th. Easter was preceded by the austerity of Lent, 40 days of fasting and penitence, and followed by the explosion of joy that characterized the Easter season. Harvest festivals, midsummer celebrations, the feast days of patron saints. The year was full of occasions for collective celebration. These celebrations were not modest. Medieval feasting, on occasions when it was available, was enthusiastic and unreserved. The contrast between the ordinary austerity of medieval diet and the abundance of feast days was dramatic, and the dramatic quality of the contrast was part of the point. You did not appreciate abundance without scarcity. The feast meant more because the ordinary day was thin. Music was everywhere in medieval life, not recorded music, not passive consumption of sound produced by others, but active, participatory music. people sang at work, and in the fields, and at the loom, and in the kitchen. They sang in church. The liturgical music of the medieval church was one of the great achievements of human aesthetic culture, the plain song of the monks, and the polyphony that developed from the 11th century onward. They sang in taverns and at celebrations, folk songs and love songs, and drinking songs that circulated orally through communities and across regions. Dancing was a communal activity at festivals and celebrations, and it served important social functions beyond entertainment. In a world where formal social mixing between unmarried young people was closely regulated, the dance was one of the few occasions on which men and women could interact physically in a publicly sanctioned context. Courtship happened at dances. The formalized steps and patterns of medieval dance gave structure and permission to physical contact that was otherwise carefully controlled. Games of all kinds were popular. At chess, introduced to Europe from the Islamic world in the 10th century, was played across social classes. Dice games were ubiquitous and persistently condemned by church authorities, who associated them with gambling and the waste of resources that should go to charity. Ball games, precursors of modern football and other sports, were played on feast days, sometimes in forms that resembled organized combat more than modern sporting events, with entire villages competing against each other across several miles of countryside. Theater and performance occupied an important place in medieval culture. The mystery plays, dramatizations of biblical stories, performed on feast days in town squares and on traveling wagons, were major cultural events, attracting large audiences and involving significant community resources. They were simultaneously entertainment, religious education, and communal expression. The stories they told, the creation, the fall, the nativity, the passion, the judgment, were the stories through which medieval people understood their world. Secular performance, acrobats, jugglers, storytellers, musicians provided entertainment at fairs and markets and noble courts. The troubadours and trouvères of southern and northern France respectively created a sophisticated tradition of secular lyric poetry and song that expressed, with remarkable directness and complexity, the emotional experience of love, longing, and loss. The chansons de geste, the epic poems celebrating the deeds of heroes like Roland and the knights of Charlemagne, entertained noble audiences while transmitting values of loyalty, courage, and honor. Storytelling in the oral tradition was the primary form of literary culture for the majority of people who could not read. Stories circulated, were adapted, accumulated new details, traveled from community to community in the mouths of travelers and merchants and wandering entertainers. The medieval story tradition is vast and various and almost entirely anonymous. We don't know who first told most of these stories, or when, or where. We know only that people told them, generation after generation, because they needed to. Let's talk about justice, because the medieval system of law and punishment is one of the aspects of the period most thoroughly misrepresented in popular imagination, and most genuinely different from modern experience. Medieval law was not a single system. It was a patchwork of overlapping jurisdictions and legal traditions, canon law governing the clergy and certain categories of cases, common law developing in England from the 12th century onward, Roman law, revived and elaborated in the Italian universities from the 11th century, and the customary law of individual manners and communities transmitted orally and applied locally. This patchwork created both flexibility and chaos. The same offense could be tried in different courts with very different outcomes, depending on who the accused was and who the accuser was and which jurisdiction had the stronger claim. Shopping for a favorable forum, choosing which court to approach, or which legal tradition to invoke was a recognized strategy. The law was not the same for everyone. The nobility operated under a different legal framework from the peasantry, with different rights, different punishments, and different access to legal process. A noble accused of a crime had the right to trial by his peers, by other nobles who might be sympathetic to his situation and reluctant to set precedents that could be used against themselves. A peasant had no such right. He appeared before the Lord's court, which was administered by the Lord's officials, applying the Lord's version of customary law. The punishments available in medieval law covered a wide range and were calibrated to social status in ways that modern legal systems formally reject. Capital punishment was available for a wide range of offenses, not just murder, but treason, major theft, heresy, and other serious crimes. The methods of execution varied by social status: hanging for commoners, beheading for nobles, burning for heretics. The execution was public, attended by the community, understood as simultaneously punishment, deterrent, and a kind of social ritual that affirmed the community's values and the authority of those who enforced them. Mutilation was a standard intermediate punishment: the removal of a hand for theft, the cutting off of an ear for certain offenses, blinding as an alternative to execution. These punishments were permanent, visible, and served as a continuous reminder of the offense to everyone who encountered the mutilated person for the rest of their life. The prison as a long-term punishment, the deprivation of liberty for a specified period as a response to an offense, was not a central feature of medieval penology in the way it is in modern law. Medieval prisons existed, but they were primarily holding facilities, places where people were kept while awaiting trial, or while arrangements were made for execution or ransom or some other resolution. The idea of imprisoning someone for 10 years as a punishment for their crime was not unknown, but it was not the default response to serious crime. This seems, to modern eyes, like barbarism. The alternative, mutilation, branding, public humiliation, death, seems obviously worse. But it is worth noting that the medieval logic had a certain coherence. If you cut off a thief's hand, you have imposed a real consequence that will affect them for the rest of their life. You have not, however, removed them from their community and their family for years. You have not created a carceral institution requiring significant ongoing resources to maintain. The punishment is immediate, visible, and final. Whether this is better or worse than the modern prison system is a genuine question that philosophers and criminologists continue to debate. The ordeal was a medieval method of proof that has no modern equivalent and that reflects, better than almost anything else, the integration of the sacred and the secular in medieval legal culture. When evidence was insufficient and the testimony of witnesses was contradictory or unavailable, medieval courts sometimes turned to the judgment of God. The ordeal by hot iron required the accused to carry a piece of heated iron for a specified distance. The wound was then bandaged and examined 3 days later. If it was healing cleanly, the accused was innocent. If it was festering, guilty. The ordeal by water required the accused to be thrown into a body of blessed water. If they floated, they were guilty, the pure water rejecting the corrupt person. If they sank, they were innocent. The ordeal was condemned by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which prohibited clerical participation in the blessing of ordeal elements, effectively abolishing it. But its existence for several centuries of medieval legal practice reveals something important. The medieval assumption that the sacred and the legal were not separate domains, that God was an active participant in the administration of justice, and that the outcome of a physical trial could be read as divine verdict. Let's step back and look at the whole day. The fire lighting in the dark, and the animal tending, and the thin breakfast, and the long hours in the field, and the chronic pain, and the inadequate medicine, and the constant proximity to death, and the cold, and the dark, and the segmented sleep. The fire lighting in the dark, and the animal tending, and the thin breakfast, and the long hours in the field, and the chronic pain, and the inadequate medicine, and the constant proximity to death, and the cold, and the dark, and the segmented sleep. How did people bear it? The question assumes that bearing it required something special, that the difficulty of medieval life was an obstacle to be overcome rather than simply the water in which medieval people swam. And this assumption, however natural it feels to us, is probably wrong. Medieval people did not experience their lives as a series of hardships to be endured. They experienced their lives as their lives. The cold was the cold. The work was the work. The pain was the pain. Not as departures from a better baseline, because there was no better baseline in their experience, but simply as what existence was. What gave medieval life meaning, what made it bearable, even rich, was the same thing that gives any life meaning: connection. Connection to family, which was the primary unit of economic and emotional support. Connection to community, the village, the guild, the parish, the networks of reciprocal obligation that provided security in a world without institutional safety nets. Connection to faith, which provided not only community, but meaning. A framework that explained suffering, that placed individual lives within a larger story, that offered the promise of something beyond the present difficulty, and connection to pleasure, because medieval people experienced pleasure abundantly and without apology. They feasted on the many holy days and celebration days that punctuated the year with an enthusiasm that reflected both genuine enjoyment and the practical wisdom of eating well when the opportunity arose. They drank ale and wine were safer than the often contaminated water supply, and they were consumed in quantities that would alarm modern health authorities. They danced, they sang, they told stories, they played games, they flirted and courted and fell in love. The medieval tavern, the alehouse, the inn, was a social institution of genuine importance. It was where people gathered in the evenings, where information was exchanged, where community bonds were maintained and negotiated, where the tensions of daily life could be released in an environment of shared relaxation. Medieval humor was robust and often remarkably earthy. The fabliaux, short comic tales popular in France in the 12th and 13th centuries, dealt in adultery, bodily functions, and the comic misadventures of clergy and peasants with a frankness that later, more prudish eras found shocking. The image of the medieval person as uniformly pious and soberly serious is simply wrong. They laughed at the same things humans have always found funny: the gap between pretension and reality, the misfortunes of the pompous, the antics of people behaving badly. They also cried, they grieved, with an intensity and a public expressiveness that modern culture tends to suppress. Medieval grief was loud. Mourners wailed, tore their clothing, threw themselves on the bodies of the dead. This was not performance. It was genuine, it was expected, and it served important social functions. The public expression of grief affirmed the value of the dead person, united the community in loss, and gave the bereaved a recognized social role during the period of mourning. Medieval people felt everything. They felt it intensely, and they expressed it without the emotional self-management that modern culture tends to demand. In the directness and intensity of emotional expression, they were perhaps more fully human than we allow ourselves to be. Here is what we have not yet answered, the question at the heart of the medieval experience of mortality and meaning. How did medieval people face the fact that they were going to die, not eventually, abstractly, in some distant future, but soon, probably before they were 40, possibly this winter, from the fever that was going around the village, possibly next harvest, if the rains failed again? The answer is complex and has been much debated, but its core is relatively clear. They faced it through faith, not the vague, uncertain, metaphorical faith of much modern religious practice, concrete, specific, institutional faith, the faith that said, "You will die, and after you die, there will be judgment, and after judgment, there will be either heaven or hell, and the church has the sacraments that prepare you for judgment, and the saints will intercede for you, and God is merciful." This framework did not eliminate the fear of death. Medieval people feared death. They feared it in the immediate physical sense. They had seen enough of it to know that it was painful and often undignified, and they feared it in the spiritual sense. Fear of judgment, fear of damnation, fear of the purgatorial suffering that might await between death and heaven. But it gave them a way to hold the fear, a context in which death was not simply a catastrophe, but a passage, a transition from this world to another, more important world, a moment of reckoning that could be prepared for, that prayers and sacraments and charitable acts could influence. The ars moriendi, the art of dying well, was a recognized genre of medieval literature, a set of practical and spiritual instructions for how to approach death. It was read widely, prepared for seriously. The idea that death was something to be done well, that it was the final and most important act of a life, it gave it a dignity and a meaning that the modern tendency to deny and defer death until the last possible moment often fails to provide. Memento mori, remember you will die, was not a morbid obsession in medieval culture. It was a practical counsel, a reminder to live well because the time was short, to treat others with justice because you would be judged for it, to not waste the days because the days were few. The medieval church was full of images of death, skeletons and death's head imagery, the dance of death with its representations of death claiming people from all walks of life, the vivid depictions of hell and its torments. These were not intended to depress or terrify the viewer, or not only to terrify. They were intended to concentrate the mind, to make real the stakes of how you lived your days, in a world where death was visible and frequent, where you had watched your children die, your parents die, your neighbors die. The reminder to remember death was not a particularly difficult feat of imagination. Death was present. What needed to be managed was the meaning you made of that presence. Now let's enter the speculative territory, the questions that the historical record raises but cannot fully answer. The first question: was medieval life worse than we think, or better? The answer is both, depending on what you measure. By almost any material standard, lifespan, nutritional adequacy, physical comfort, access to medical care, safety from violence, medieval life was worse than modern life in developed countries, dramatically worse. The improvements of the past 2 centuries in all of these dimensions have been so large that comparison is almost meaningless. But material standards are not the only standards, and on some non-material dimensions, community connection, sense of purpose and meaning, relationship with time and nature, emotional expressiveness, integration of work and life, the historical picture is more ambiguous. Medieval people were embedded in communities in ways that most modern people are not. The isolation and loneliness that characterize significant portions of modern developed world life, the epidemic of loneliness that social researchers have documented in the 21st century, were largely absent from medieval life, not because medieval people were particularly virtuous, but because the structures of medieval life, the village, the parish, the guild, made isolation practically difficult. Medieval people had a relationship with time that was less fragmented and more embodied than modern experience tends to be. The work was physical, rhythmic, connected to the natural cycles of the seasons. The days were structured by the canonical hours, the bells of the monastery or parish church marking the time for prayer throughout the day, in a way that gave time a texture and a meaning that the undifferentiated passage of digital minutes does not. The second speculative question: why did medieval people accept conditions that seem, from the outside, almost unbearable? The answer has several parts. First, they had no comparison. The counterfactual, a world of antibiotics and central heating and reliable food supply, did not exist in their imagination. You do not mourn the absence of something you cannot conceive of. Medieval people were not enduring a departure from a better world. They were living in the only world there was. Second, the conditions of medieval life, however hard, were not uniformly experienced as suffering. The work was hard, but it had the satisfactions that meaningful physical labor provides. The community was constrictive, but it was also genuinely supportive. The faith was demanding, but it also provided meaning, comfort, and community in ways that secular modernity has not fully replaced. Third, people adapt. The psychological research on what makes people happy consistently shows that adaptation, the adjustment of expectations and experience to current conditions, is one of the most powerful and pervasive features of human psychology. People adapt to bad circumstances. They find satisfactions within constraints. They make the best of what is available. Medieval people adapted. They found their satisfactions, their pleasures, their connections within the constraints of medieval life. They did not need to be comparable to modern life to be worth living. They just needed to be livable, and for most people, most of the time, they were. The second speculative question brings us to something that modern science has only recently begun to investigate seriously. Did the difficulty of medieval life produce, paradoxically, a kind of psychological resilience that modern life undermines? The research on post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon by which people who have experienced serious adversity sometimes emerge from it with stronger relationships, deeper meaning, and greater appreciation for life than they had before, suggests that suffering, when survived, can be transformative rather than merely destructive. Not always, not for everyone, and the suffering has to be survivable. There is no growth in being destroyed. But the medieval world produced people who had survived things, who had watched children die and kept going, who had endured famines and kept farming, who had buried half their community in a plague year and rebuilt. The accumulated experience of survival, the knowledge, not theoretical but visceral, that you had gotten through the unsurvivable, may have produced a psychological depth and resilience that a life without serious adversity does not. Modern positive psychology has documented the phenomenon of hedonic adaptation, the tendency of human beings to return to a baseline level of happiness relatively quickly after both positive and negative events. E-lottery winners are not significantly happier a year after their win than they were before. People who have experienced serious accidents or disabilities are not significantly less happy a year after their misfortune. Medieval people adapted to their baseline. Their baseline was hard, but they adapted to it, found their satisfactions within it, and experienced the full range of human emotion, joy, love, humor, beauty, within conditions that we would find intolerable. The implication is uncomfortable, that human happiness is less dependent on external circumstances than we tend to assume, that the relationship between how good your life is, materially, and how happy you are, is weaker than modern consumer culture insists. Medieval people did not need what we need to be happy. They needed what everyone needs: connection, purpose, meaning, community, beauty. They found these things within the constraints of their world. We have removed most of the constraints, and we are not obviously happier. The third speculative question is the one that haunts me most. What did medieval people know that we have forgotten? The question feels presumptuous. It is easy to romanticize a past that we don't have to live in. Easy to find wisdom in the constraints of a world that killed half its children and buried its dead at 40. But there are things that medieval life had, or that medieval culture knew, that the modern world has lost or is losing. The knowledge of how to die, the ars moriendi, the practice of dying well, surrounded by community, with the sacraments, with the rituals that gave the dying a recognized role and the living a recognized way to respond. This is something that modern death management, with its hospitalization and medicalization and isolation of the dying, has largely dismantled. The knowledge of how to grieve, the public, communal, ritualized expressions of grief that medieval culture practiced, the wailing, the mourning dress, the formal period of bereavement, gave grief a shape and a social context. They told the bereaved, "This is what you do now, this is how long it lasts, This is the community's role in supporting you. Modern grief tends to be private, uncertain, and poorly supported. The knowledge of how to be in community, not the easy community of people who agree with you and share your interests. The difficult community of people you are stuck with, who you disagree with and sometimes dislike, but who you are bound to by geography and necessity and the shared project of surviving. Medieval communities were not harmonious. They were contentious, litigious, full of conflict, but they were real. They required genuine engagement with people unlike yourself, and that engagement, difficult, frustrating, irreplaceable, is something that modern life has made increasingly optional. The knowledge of how to be small. Medieval people understood themselves as small, not worthless. The theological framework affirmed the value of every soul, but small in the cosmos, temporary in history, one person in an enormous, ancient, ongoing story that began long before them and would continue long after. This smallness was not experienced as insignificance. It was experienced as belonging. You were small, but you were part of something large. Your life was brief, but it was embedded in a story that was not brief. Your suffering was real, but it was shared by the community around you, by the saints who had suffered before you, by Christ himself, whose suffering gave all suffering meaning. Modern individualism, the understanding of the self as the primary unit of meaning and the primary locus of value, is in many ways a liberation. But it is also perhaps a source of the particular anxiety that characterizes modern life, the anxiety of the self that must generate its own meaning, sustain its own worth, face its own death without the scaffolding of a community and a cosmic story. Medieval people did not have to do that. The scaffolding was there, built into the world they inhabited, into the church they attended, into the calendar they followed, into the community they were embedded in. They could be small without feeling lost. The day is ending. The fire is covered. The animals are settled. The children are asleep, their small warm bodies generating the heat that helps the family make it through the night. Outside, the medieval dark is absolute. No street lights, no lit windows from other houses, just the darkness and the cold and the stars if the clouds have broken. In the village, other fires are dying down too. Other families are settling into their first sleep. A dog barks somewhere across the common, once, twice, then quiet. An owl calls from the direction of the wood. The wind moves through the thatch overhead. The sounds of medieval night were different from modern night sounds, not quieter necessarily. The absence of mechanical noise was offset by the presence of animal noise, of wind without insulation to soften it, of the creaks and settlings of wood-framed structures that were never quite still, but different in quality. The sounds were mostly natural, mostly recognizable, mostly explicable. When something moved in the dark that you couldn't identify, it was genuinely possible that it was something you could not explain. The first sleep is coming, and in the middle of the night, in that natural waking that medieval people expected and were not disturbed by, there will be time to pray, to lie in the quiet and think, to be with the darkness without demanding that it resolve itself into light. Medieval people were comfortable with darkness in a way that modern people, surrounded by artificial light, have largely lost. Not unafraid of it, The dark was genuinely dangerous in their world, as we have discussed, but habituated to it, familiar with its textures and its sounds, able to exist within it without the anxiety that modern people, accustomed to being able to dispel darkness at will, often feel when they cannot. There is something in this habituation that is worth noticing. Modern anxiety, the chronic, low-level anxiety that characterizes so much of modern mental life, is sometimes analyzed as the consequence of overstimulation, of the constant availability of distraction, of the inability to simply be with oneself in quiet. Medieval people were forced, by the structure of their world, to spend significant time in quiet and darkness. The long winter nights, the time before the fire got going in the morning, the middle of the night waking, in the absence of screens or podcasts or anything to do but think and pray. This was not comfortable. It was not designed for comfort, but it may have been, in ways we are only beginning to understand, necessary. The mind needs quiet the way the body needs sleep. Medieval life enforced a certain quantum of quiet, however involuntary, however uncomfortable. We have abolished the involuntary quiet. We have replaced it with an endless supply of stimulation, available at any moment, designed specifically to prevent the mind from settling into itself. Whether this is progress is a question that medieval people would have found very strange. They would have had no concept of the alternative. We have the alternative, and we are not sure we are better for having it. The second sleep came eventually, and with it, dreams. Medieval people took dreams seriously. Not all dreams. The Church distinguished between meaningless dreams, produced by the body's processes, and meaningful dreams, through which God or his angels could communicate. The literature of the period is full of significant dreams, prophetic, symbolic, morally instructive, and dream interpretation was a recognized intellectual activity. Whether medieval dreams were different in content from modern dreams is impossible to know directly, but the framework through which they were interpreted was different. A modern person, waking from a disturbing dream, might analyze it in terms of unresolved anxiety or suppressed desire. A medieval person, waking from the same dream, might examine it for spiritual meaning. Was it a warning from God, a temptation from the devil, a message from the soul of a deceased relative? The night had meaning, the darkness had meaning, even sleep and dreams had meaning. In a world without the secular frameworks through which modern people organize their experience, meaning was everywhere. Everything pointed to something beyond itself. The ordinary and the sacred were not separate categories, but the same reality seen from different angles. A cow giving birth in the barn was also a reminder of the nativity. A sudden storm was also a possible divine message. A dream of fire was also a possible warning of hell. The world was thick with significance. Nothing was merely itself. This density of meaning could be oppressive, the terror of a world in which every event might be a sign directed specifically at you, in which the universe was constantly communicating and you were constantly responsible for interpreting it correctly. But it could also be, in a way that is hard to recover from the perspective of a secular modernity, deeply comforting. You were not alone in a meaningless universe. You were embedded in a story. The darkness had a reason. Tomorrow will come. The cock will crow before dawn, and the first grayness will show through the gap in the thatch, and the fire will need to be rebuilt, and the animals will need tending, and the long day of work will begin again. And the people in this house, these people who have no antibiotics, no central heating, no reliable food supply, no protection from the violence of an unstable world, will get up. They will complain about the cold. They will argue about who left the door open. One of the children will be difficult about breakfast. The cow will be in a mood. And the day will proceed, as all days proceed, full of small annoyances and small satisfactions, moments of genuine connection and moments of frustration, flashes of beauty in the quality of the winter light on the frozen common, unexpected humor in something a neighbor says at the well, life, unremarkable, irreplaceable, ordinary human life, the same life in its essentials that you are living right now, in a warmer house, with better food, with medicine that actually works, with the extraordinary luxury of knowing that your children will probably not die before you, but the same life, the same needs, the same fears, the same loves, the same hunger for meaning and connection, and the reassurance that it is all, somehow, worthwhile. That reassurance, medieval people found it in their faith, in their community, in the rhythms of a world that was hard but comprehensible, in the promise that the suffering had a reason and the reason was good. Where we find it is a question each of us has to answer for ourselves. But the need is the same. It has always been the same. Across all the centuries and all the changes, the human creature needs to know that it matters, that it is held, that it is not alone in the dark. Medieval people knew how to be held by the dark. They had no choice but to learn. Perhaps there is something in that learning worth recovering. Tomorrow will be the same, and the day after that, and the year after that, and somehow, that is enough. You wouldn't last a day in medieval Europe. You're right, you wouldn't. Not because you are weak, not because you are cowardly, but because you have been built by a different world, a world of comfort and safety and abundance that is historically unprecedented and extraordinarily fragile. The people who lived in medieval Europe were built by that world. They were hardened by it and shaped by it, and in some ways broken by it. But they were also, and in the ways that matter most, fully human, fully present, fully alive. They loved, they grieved, they laughed, they believed. They survived things that should not have been survivable, and then they got up the next morning and did it again. Tonight, in whatever warmth surrounds you, feel it. The pillow beneath your head, the blanket over your body, the absence of cold, the absence of hunger, the silence that is safety rather than threat. These things are not ordinary. They are extraordinary. They are the product of centuries of human struggle and ingenuity and accumulated luck. They are not guaranteed. They are not permanent. But tonight, they are yours. Sleep well. You made it through another day. So did they. Good night.